"Who touched you?" said the Mafia boss. And then, the whole city knew her wasn't just his maid. The scent of wood polish clung to my skin like a second layer as I moved in slow, deliberate circles across the walnut tabletop. Nearly 30 feet long, this table was more than just a luxurious furnishing. It had quietly witnessed power exchanges that would make even the grandest courtrooms seem tame by comparison, and I pretended not to know any of it. The mansion was suffocatingly quiet today, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest until your breath comes shallow and forced. Outside, a steady rain traced silver ribbons down the floor-to-ceiling windows, softening the edges of the meticulously trimmed garden beyond, blurring it into a watercolor world of gray and green and blue. I was not supposed to be in this room. The main dining hall was normally handled by Mrs. Matilda, but she had called in sick this morning, and I was assigned in her place. After 3 months working in the immense Blackwell estate, there were still many rooms I had never stepped foot in. Just the thought of that sent a chill through me, despite the warmth of the autumn air. "You missed a spot." The voice came from behind, low and slow, touched with a southern drawl and an authority that never needed to raise itself. I froze. I hadn't heard his footsteps. I never did. Graham Blackwell always moved like a hunting cat, silent, precise, never announcing his presence. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell," I said, without turning around. "I'll go over it again." I felt him approach more than heard him. The air in the room seemed to shift, the molecules rearranging themselves to make room for him. My heart pounded in my chest as he stopped just behind me. "Look at me when I speak to you, Julia." I turned slowly, carefully, as though even the slightest movement might shatter the charged stillness. Graham Blackwell, 54 years old, once a strategic operative, now the head of the largest private security firm on the East Coast. But he didn't look like a former soldier or a businessman. He looked like a living extension of this house itself, sharp, cold, impenetrable. His hair was salt and pepper, neatly cut. His eyes were the color of steel, cold but deep enough to make people step back. His face had the kind of classic chiseled beauty that looked as though it had been carved from marble by a sculptor who did not know how to make mistakes. "This is your first time cleaning this room." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Matilda's out sick." He looked at me slowly, his gaze moving from my face to my hands, still holding the polishing cloth. I fought the urge to hide them. The skin was dry, cracked from months of cleaning agents. 3 months here had left their mark. These were the same hands that once kept newborns alive in a neonatal intensive care unit. "You're doing a good job," he said after a pause. "Better than that old woman." A compliment from Graham Blackwell was as rare as snow in August. I bowed my head, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, sir." He moved to the head of the table, letting his fingertips skim the glossy surface. "Sit with me a moment." It was not a suggestion. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 3 more rooms still needed cleaning before my shift ended. "Sir, Sit down, Julia." I took the chair he pulled out, 3 seats away from him, far enough to maintain the boundary between master and servant. Or so I thought. But Graham sat right beside me, his cologne wrapped around me, subtle and expensive, wood and smoke, as if he carried the memory of a forest from some long-ago decade. "How long have you worked here?" 3 months, sir." "Before that, you were a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital, neonatal intensive care." I held my breath. I had never told him that. No one in the house knew. "Yes, sir." "That's quite a shift. From hospital wards to dining halls." I felt the air leave my lungs. How much did he know? Did he know about Eliza? About what I had run from? About the reason I changed my name, buried my past? About the man who had turned a dream of family into a waking nightmare? "I needed a change," I said, treading as carefully as if I were walking across ice. Graham leaned back, casual in the way only the truly powerful can be. But I knew nothing about him was ever truly casual. A nurse like you could work anywhere, and yet here you are, cleaning floors for minimum wage. I clenched my hands beneath the table. The pay here is steady, sir. A faint smile touched his mouth. Steady, perhaps, but beneath your worth. I didn't get the chance to respond. The double doors behind us opened. Evelyn Parker, his personal assistant, stepped in. Her gaze brushed over me, then landed on him. Sir, Mr. Langford is waiting. Something about the port issue. Graham's face didn't change, but the air in the room grew colder. I said I wasn't to be disturbed. He insists, sir. Says it's urgent. Graham exhaled. A simple breath. But in him it sounded like thunder rolling across a cloudless sky. Wait here, Julia. We're not finished. He stood, buttoning his jacket. As he left with Evelyn, the doors closed behind them with the softest click. But the sound echoed inside me, and I remained seated, motionless. Graham Blackwell had never looked at me before. He had always walked past as if I were furniture. And now he knew my past. And I couldn't tell whether that made me feel safer or more afraid. Before we continue with the second part of the story, if you feel this quiet rhythm has touched a corner of your heart, take a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel Dear Single Mom. Every subscription, every like or share you offer is not only an incredible source of encouragement for us, but also a way to bring stories like this to the many women out there who are quietly fighting their own battles. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or country so we can see just how far this journey has reached. And if you've ever walked through days when no one seemed to understand, don't hesitate to share a few words. Somewhere, someone might be waiting to read your story. And now, let us return to part 2. I sat motionless in the cold chair, my hands still clenched tightly around the cleaning cloth, eyes fixed on the door that had just closed, as if staring long enough might somehow turn everything back to the way it was. But it wouldn't. Everything had changed. Graham Blackwell knew who I was. Not Julia the housemaid, not the silent woman who moved through long, quiet hallways unnoticed. He knew I had once been a nurse, knew where I had worked, knew where I had belonged before I disappeared from the map, before I became someone with a borrowed name. I left the dining room with the lightest steps possible, as though the smallest sound might bring the whole house crashing down. Along the long wooden hallway, the antique paintings hung in perfect rows, their painted eyes seeming to follow me. I made my way to the laundry room where my locker was, retrieved my bag, and slipped out through the side door to the rear parking lot. My old silver car, the only thing I had kept from my previous life, sat still beneath the rain. I got behind the wheel, didn't turn the key, just sat there, silently, while water traced its way down the windshield like memories sliding back through time. I had once been a neonatal intensive care nurse at St. Catherine's, one of the largest hospitals in the state. I was not the best, but I was careful, and I cared. Nights spent beside premature infants, the sudden blare of monitors, the fragile weight of life balanced on the edge. I loved that job. It gave me purpose after life had hit hard, until I met Ronald Shaw, a successful man, handsome, charming, with a voice that could wrap itself around your heart and eyes that made you feel like you were the only one in the room. It started like a dream. White roses, elegant dinners, promises of a life I never believed I deserved. I never thought I would fall for someone like him, but I did. Deeply, blindly, foolishly. Within months, I moved in with him. He controlled every inch of my day, called constantly, asked what I wore, what I ate, where I was going, who I spoke to. At first, I thought it was love, attention. Then came the first dinner thrown across the floor because I came home late. The phone smashed against the wall because I didn't answer on time. The first slap, then the apology, then larger bouquets. And the dream slowly turned to nightmare. I was nearly 33 when I became pregnant. Eliza was not planned, but I have never, not for one moment, regretted her. She became the reason I stayed alive. But Ronald didn't want a child unless he could use it. He began to talk about legacy, about influence, about control. Said I had to give birth in the hospital of his choosing, name her as he wished, raise her by his design. I pushed back. He pushed harder. One night, in my 7th month, he shoved me down the stairs. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated wrist, a swelling behind my skull. But Eliza held on, tiny, delicate, but fierce. When I woke in that hospital bed, I knew I had to leave. I filed for a restraining order in secret, collected papers, changed phones, sold everything I could. One night, under rain much like tonight's, I left the city with a 10-day-old baby in my arms. I arrived in Charleston with a new name, Julia Monroe, my mother's maiden name. I rented a back room in the house of an old Italian widow and used what little savings I had left to pay 6 months in advance. Every day, I left Eliza with her when I could. When I couldn't, I took my daughter with me, tucked her into a break room crib, and moved through each hour like a shadow. When I heard the Blackwell estate was hiring, I knew it was the only chance I had at both a steady income and the kind of security that might hide me. I never thought I'd be found. I had been so careful. No one here knew my real name. No one knew who Eliza's father was. I kept my head down, made no friends, had no conversations. I worked, went home, held my daughter to sleep, woke in the night just to check the locks again. But now Graham Blackwell knew. And if he knew, who else might? Was Ronald tracing my steps, ready to take my daughter from me? I looked up at the rearview mirror, my reflection blurred through fogged glass. Hair damp and wild, clothes clinging with rain, a face that wore every mile of the distance I had come to protect my child. I could not stop now, but maybe I had stepped into something even more dangerous than what I had fled. And the name Graham Blackwell, with those steel-gray eyes, I could no longer tell if it meant protection or if it was simply another kind of chain, richer, colder, and far more lethal. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and Charleston was just beginning to stir, damp and gray in the aftermath of last night's rain. I hadn't slept. I had lain motionless beside Eliza, listening to her fragile, rhythmic breaths, my eyes fixed on the dim ceiling above us. The sense of safety I had so carefully stitched together over the past 3 months now felt as delicate as a crystal glass with a hairline fracture. I didn't know what Graham Blackwell would do with what he knew about me. Part of me wanted to believe he was a decent man. The other part screamed for caution. A man like him didn't ask questions of the staff out of idle curiosity. He had a purpose. I was polishing the eastern hallway when Evelyn appeared. She was always dressed in gray, her hair tightly pinned back, her face unreadable. She called my name with her usual calm tone, but her eyes swept over me in a way that felt like measurement. "Mr. Blackwell would like to see you. Right now." I wiped my hands on my apron, gave a quiet nod, and followed her. This time, he wasn't meeting me in the dining room or the library. Evelyn led me to the 2nd floor, to the study that no staff was ever permitted to enter. She opened the door, nodded once, and turned away. I stood in the threshold for a long second, heart pounding, then stepped inside. The room was spacious, the light gentle through heavy drapes. On the desk, a thick stack of documents lay in neat order. Graham Blackwell stood by a bookshelf, sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, tie loosened, one hand holding a cup of coffee, the other resting on an open book. "Please, sit." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that left little room for refusal. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, back straight, hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. He walked around the desk, set his coffee down, and looked directly at me. Julia, I'll be direct. I need a woman to pose as my fiancé. Temporarily. I thought I had misheard him. I'm sorry. What did you say? He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced. I need someone to stand beside me at a few upcoming social functions. Someone with the right image. Discreet. Trustworthy. You fit the bill. You have no entanglements in society, few relationships, and strong personal reasons to keep your identity private. That makes you more reliable than anyone else. I stood without thinking. Sir, I believe you're mistaken. I'm just a housemaid. I can't. Graham looked up, his eyes sharp enough to cut through the air between us. You're an educated woman. You've worked under pressure. And you know how to keep your mouth shut. I'm not asking for someone to love. I need a temporary partner. In return, I'll offer you complete protection. You and your daughter. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. He knew about Eliza. I took a step back, hands clenched so tightly my nails pressed into my palms. I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not someone you can buy for the sake of appearances. I came here to work, not to become a pawn in someone else's performance. Graham rose and walked toward me, his gaze never wavering. I am not asking you to sell yourself. I am giving you a choice. Do you really think you and your child can live hidden forever? Ronald Shaw has hired investigators for the third time. One of them was in Charleston last week. He has not given up. The room tilted. Every cell in my body seemed to turn to ice. How do you know that? He opened a drawer and slid a photograph across the desk. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I picked it up. It was me and Eliza, walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks from where we lived. Taken from a distance but unmistakable. My eyes burned. You have been watching me. I do not need to watch. I only need to observe the right targets. I do not make a habit of saving people. But in your case, I am willing to break that rule. His words fell like a sentence handed down in a courtroom. I could not tell if it was an offer or a warning. I stared at Eliza in the picture, her little face bright with joy, innocent, unaware that fear stalked us every single day. I set the photograph back on the desk and lifted my head. I need time to think. Graham said nothing, only offered a steady nod. I turned and walked out, fast, escaping his breath, his presence, his proposal that felt as much like protection as it did a gilded cage. But deep down, I already understood. This choice was no longer about want, it was about survival. And Eliza, my small and shining girl, could not be the price of my pride. I left the mansion with legs heavy as stone. That photograph stayed etched in my mind. Eliza's smile suspended against a washed gray sky, and someone behind a camera we never saw. For weeks, I had felt eyes on me. At first, I told myself it was trauma, that I was simply seeing ghosts of my fear. But now Graham had confirmed it. The danger was real. I hurried along the stone sidewalk, turning the corner toward the small boarding house in the south of Charleston. The rain had stopped, but the earth still breathed damp air, droplets falling from leaves like quiet warnings. My heart pounded. I did not know which frightened me more, the watcher in the shadows or Graham's offer wrapped in power and protection. As I approached the house, something inside me pulled tight. The front door was not locked as it always was. It stood slightly open. I never forgot to lock the door. I slowed, pulse hammering. The air inside felt thick, hallway light flickering. I reached for the knob just as hurried footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs. A stranger's silhouette slipped down the hallway and out the back door before I could see his face. I ran without thinking, shouting my daughter's name. Eliza. No answer. I charged up the stairs and shoved open our door. She sat curled on the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. Mama is here. I pulled her into my arms, my whole body trembling. Eliza did not cry. She clung to me, tiny fingers gripping my shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "Mommy, someone asked me if I am Eliza." He knew my name. He stood by the window. He said he would come back. I held my daughter tighter, my heart seemingly suspended in silence. I didn't know how long I sat there like that, cradling her against the fear, until the sound of a car pulling up outside broke through the haze. A black vehicle, polished and silent, with dark windows and no visible plates. The door opened, and Evelyn stepped out, followed by Graham. He wore a long coat, his eyes sweeping across the shabby boarding house until they settled on the window of my room. I didn't know who had called him, perhaps a neighbor, or maybe he had someone watching me from the moment I left the estate. But in that moment, I no longer cared. Graham entered without knocking, his eyes passing quickly over Eliza, still curled into my lap. "We need to leave, now." I didn't ask how he knew. I simply rose, still clutching Eliza close, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Can you keep us safe?" He didn't speak. He just nodded. The kind of nod a man gives when he refuses to promise anything he can't keep. I stepped into the hallway, Eliza clinging to my neck, her little body still rigid with fear. Evelyn held the car door open. Graham steadied me as I stepped in. As the car pulled away from the crumbling curb of that worn-out street, I looked back one final time. The small home I once believed could hold our safety now lay behind me, like a shadow stretched beneath the streetlight. I tightened my arms around my daughter, drew a deep breath, and turned to Graham. "I'll do it. If the offer still stands, I'll be your fiancé. But you have to swear that Eliza will be safe." He didn't look at me right away, only kept his gaze steady on the window, watching the city slip past. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "I don't swear oaths, but I don't break my word, especially when a child is involved." I believed him, not entirely, not without reservation, but enough. Because Eliza was everything, and for the first time in years I let someone else take the wheel, hand over control, for one reason alone. My daughter deserved to live, not to hide, and if Graham Blackwell was the man who could give her that chance, then I would take the risk. Even if I knew in the quiet corners of my mind that I was stepping into a world that had never been meant for someone like me. We moved into the mansion on a clear morning, with soft wind trailing through the trees. Eliza had fallen asleep on my shoulder as the black car rolled past the towering iron gates and eased down the stone-paved drive. I remember the sound of the wheels crunching gently over gravel, a small, ordinary noise that felt somehow like crossing a threshold into something permanent. From that moment forward, I was no longer Julia the maid. I was Julia, the woman Graham Blackwell had chosen to stand beside him. Even if it was only a role, even if it was nothing more than an arrangement, it was enough to change everything. Evelyn had prepared everything. Our rooms were in the eastern wing of the estate, a quiet stretch overlooking the orange grove, with a private path that led down to the library. The space was 3 times the size of our old apartment. Clean white sheets, heavy curtains, a wardrobe already filled with elegant dresses, each one carefully selected. Every item was expensive and perfect, so much so that I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I was no longer the woman who scrubbed laundry by hand in a narrow tub. I was now the woman who would walk beside Graham Blackwell in public, the woman who had been given a name, a role, and a story. The first party arrived sooner than I expected. Not even 48 hours after we had moved in, Evelyn handed me a small jewelry box and spoke with her usual brevity. "Mr. Blackwell would like you to wear the navy blue gown. The event begins at 7. Be in the grand hall by 6:30. I nodded, though my mouth was dry. Eliza stayed behind at the mansion with a nanny Evelyn had arranged. She cried when I left the room, clutching the hem of my dress with both hands, her eyes wide with fear. I promised her I'd be back soon, but my heart was knotted with unease. 4 women from the styling team took turns touching my hair, my skin, my nails as if I were an object being carefully refined. When I looked in the mirror, it took several seconds for me to recognize the woman staring back. Her hair was pinned neatly, the gown hugged her shape, and the silver heels made her look both strong and fragile at once. But it was the eyes that had changed the most. They no longer reflected the quiet endurance I had grown used to. They held something closer to resolve. Graham waited for me at the foot of the staircase, dressed in black, his silver-gray tie catching the light. Tall and composed, he watched me for a long moment, long enough for the blood to rush to my face, then said softly, "You look perfect." I didn't know how to answer. I only nodded. He offered his arm, and after a beat of hesitation, I placed my hand over his. His skin was warm, his grip steady, every movement controlled, yet never forceful. Together, we stepped into the grand hall where the soft strains of jazz floated through the air, and crystal chandeliers scattered light across the high ceiling like stardust. Guests had begun to gather. They were powerful people from the worlds of finance, politics, and legacy names I had only ever seen printed in headlines. Every step beside Graham felt like I was walking through a play I hadn't rehearsed. I smiled. I nodded. I spoke in short, practiced phrases guided by his cues. But I could feel their eyes on me, all of them. Not everyone believed in the sudden appearance of Graham Blackwell's fiancée. Some looked skeptical, others curious, and a few quietly envious. One man in a nearby circle raised his glass toward me with a playful smirk. "Graham, where have you been hiding her all this time? A hidden gem?" Graham's hand remained gently at my back as he smiled. "I don't like flaunting treasures until I'm sure I can keep them." The group laughed, and I laughed with them, though inside I felt anything but light. As the laughter faded, Graham leaned closer, his voice low beside my ear. "You're doing well. Don't be nervous. They're starting to believe it." I nodded, pushing down the feeling that I was drifting through a world that didn't belong to me. By the end of the evening, when the crowd had begun to thin and the glitter of the night was slowly fading into quiet, a woman approached. She was older, tall, draped in deep red velvet, and carried herself with the kind of effortless authority that didn't need introduction. Her gaze settled on me, not with anger, but with a sharpness that felt like the edge of a polished blade. I had seen her face before on the front pages of financial magazines, beside headlines that mentioned her divorce from a once prominent politician. She was a woman of weight and quiet power in circles where money whispered louder than any voice. She spoke to Graham, but her eyes never left mine. She has the eyes of someone who has been through things. That's not a bad thing, if you know how to hold on to it. Then, just like that, she turned and walked away, her presence vanishing into the silk of the night as if she'd never been there at all. I stood frozen, that single line echoing louder than the jazz still humming from the corners of the hall. It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning, wrapped in civility, and lined with implication. When we returned to our rooms, Graham released my arm and spoke quietly. "It'll be easier if you learn to slip into the role more quickly. But tonight, you did well. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we'll bring more." He turned and walked away, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there in the dark, surrounded by polished wood and velvet silence, unsure what tired me more, the scrutiny, the layered words that cut deeper than they seemed, or the feeling of his hand on my back all night long, a touch I couldn't say was real or rehearsed. As his fiancée, I now lived in what was likely the safest house in all of Charleston, and yet, it felt like the most beautiful cage I had ever entered. And every cage, no matter how golden, has a lock, even when it's called something as sweet as marriage. The next morning, Charleston woke beneath a hush of pale sunlight, soft and golden, like brushed velvet. The first rays slipped through the thick curtains and touched the polished wood floors of the new room, waking me before the alarm ever had the chance. Eliza was still asleep, curled around her stuffed rabbit, her breathing steady and calm. I sat at the edge of the bed for a while, running my fingers gently through her hair, then stood and stepped out onto the balcony. From the second floor, the garden stretched below like a painting brought to life, meticulously trimmed, silent and still, so perfect it looked untouched by nature. Nothing here was left to chance. Every leaf, every stone, every hedge was calculated. Just like the life I had stepped into. A life beside Graham Blackwell, a man I still could not read, still could not trust completely, and yet was now the one figure between me and a world that wanted to erase me. I didn't yet know if he was saving me or pulling me into a far more elegant, far more dangerous game than any I had ever imagined. That morning, Evelyn brought me to meet with a designer. "Graham wants you to evolve your image," she said, her voice as emotionless as ever. "Don't stand out too much, but don't disappear either. People will be watching you now. You're his fiancée." I gave her a weak smile. I had once been a nurse, once stood beside mothers as they fought through blood and exhaustion just to keep their babies breathing. And now, here I was, sitting still while someone measured my waistline and matched lipstick shades to evening lights. I didn't know how far I had wandered from the woman I used to be. I only knew there was no going back. By noon, Graham appeared with a surprise invitation, an art gallery opening in the heart of the city, attended by politicians, business moguls, and the press. A public event, with cameras, lights, and headlines. I looked at him, unable to hide the fear creeping up inside me. This wasn't the kind of gathering I could fake my way through. I didn't know how to pretend that well. He understood, but only said, "We just need a few photos. You stand beside me, smile, and let me handle the rest. You've already done better than most women who've had that title for real." I couldn't tell if I should feel reassured or insulted, but I nodded, because I had no other choice. That afternoon, I stepped out of the car beneath a canopy of ancient oaks surrounding a weathered red brick building. The doors opened to the sound of soft music, golden light spilling over everything with a dreamy hue. The host announced our arrival, Graham Blackwell and his fiancée, Julia Monroe. My chest tightened as every eye turned toward me, camera flashes flickering like sparks in a storm. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it truly lasted, Graham reached for my hand and drew me gently closer. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to my temple. Not showy, not forced, but not pretend either. That kiss left me unsteady. I hadn't expected it. And what frightened me more was that it didn't unsettle me in the way I thought it would. I felt something I couldn't name, a tenderness I'd only read about in books, a touch that landed precisely where my heart had begun to wear thin. I smiled instinctively, turning toward him. Graham held my gaze for a moment, his expression softening. Before all these powerful people, he didn't need to perform. He just needed to exist. And I only had to stand beside him. No one questioned it. No one doubted. Because for that fleeting moment it felt real enough that even I began to believe I belonged. After the event, as the car drifted silently through Charleston's old streets, I glanced over at Graham. He was reading something on his phone, his face calm, unreadable. I thought about asking him why he kissed me in front of all those people, but I stayed quiet. Some questions don't need answers. Or maybe I was afraid of the answer, because if it had been for show, I would feel the ache of that truth. But if it hadn't, then I had no idea what I would do with the warmth that had taken root inside me. That night, I lay beside Eliza, my thoughts tangled and restless. I had never believed in salvation, But Graham Blackwell was giving me something I thought I'd lost for good. Not just safety, but the feeling of being seen, of being touched, and maybe of being needed. Yet I knew that anything that comes too quickly always carries a cost, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to pay it. I woke around 3 in the morning, pulled from sleep by the soft vibration of my phone beneath the pillow. The dim glow of the screen stung my eyes, but the message that appeared cut through my fatigue like ice. You think he can protect you forever? No name, no history. Just one line, cold and sharp, like a blade slid quietly into the heart of the night. I sat upright, clutching the phone, my pulse pounding in my chest. The room around me was still, silent except for the soft whir of the ceiling fan and the steady, peaceful breath of Eliza in her sleep. I glanced around, my gaze settling on the window. The curtains were drawn, but the darkness beyond suddenly felt alive, watching. I didn't reply. I didn't call anyone. I turned off the screen, set the phone on the table, and sat there in the dark for what felt like a long, hollow stretch of time. My mind was blank, save for a single thought echoing over and over. It was him. It was Ronald. He had found me. Or at least, he was closer than he'd ever been. I thought of Graham, of the promise he'd made that I would be safe here. But what does safety even mean when someone can still reach you through a single line of text? When he's still out there, alive, free, and rich enough to keep coming. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Graham. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I feared he'd respond with more guards, more cameras, more layers of surveillance until this place resembled a prison carved from marble and gold. Maybe because I didn't want Eliza to see me unravel. She was just beginning to settle into this life, smiling more, eating better, sleeping through the night. I couldn't drag her back into the shadows with my fear, but I started to notice, in the garden, along the stone paths between the wings of the house, in the blind spots beyond the reach of security cameras, shapes, movements, people that didn't quite belong. A man in a repairman's uniform lingering near the garage, though no one had reported an issue. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat standing just outside the fence, watching as I walked Eliza along the orchard path. Faces I didn't recognize. Not strange enough to raise alarms, but not familiar enough to trust. They wore the camouflage of normalcy, and that's what made them terrifying. They hid in plain sight. And for the first time since stepping into this new life, I no longer felt like I was being rescued. I felt hunted. I was folding clothes in my room when I stepped out onto the balcony to take down a towel drying in the soft breeze. I looked down into the garden where 2 gardeners were trimming the lawn. Then I saw a third figure. No uniform. No tools. Standing behind the big tree near the western fence. Standing completely still. Looking up at me. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. When I looked again, he was gone. I did not know if I was imagining things, losing myself to paranoia, or truly being watched. But the sensation was too sharp, too real to dismiss. I began sleeping with the lights on. I watched my surroundings every time I moved. I kept Eliza within reach at all times. I said nothing to her, yet I knew children feel fear even when we try to hide it. Lately, she had been startling in her sleep and turning toward the window while she played. "Mommy, I heard someone last night." A soft tapping, like someone touching the glass. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, imagination, the mind replaying old terror. But the cold that ran along my spine told me otherwise. I began writing things down. Times, faces, places where strangers appeared. None of it was enough to prove anything, but enough for me to know one truth. Someone was circling, watching, and I was the target. That night, I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the garden glowing under security lights. I saw Graham beneath the veranda, speaking on the phone. The light from beneath the eaves cast shadows across his face, hardening his features, revealing tension in every line. I knew I had to tell him. I could not keep carrying this alone. Yet something in me hesitated. I had lived so long protecting myself, concealing, fighting without witnesses. To speak aloud meant admitting I no longer controlled my fate. And that frightened me more than the figure under the tree. But I also knew that if I stayed silent one more night, the next time that watcher appeared, he might not stay in the shadows. I woke just before dawn and took Eliza into the garden behind the house to pick oranges as we always did. The early sun filtered through the leaves, scattering soft patches of golden light across the grass. So peaceful, it almost made me forget how thin this illusion of safety truly was. Eliza ran a few steps ahead, her little dress brushing over the dew-kissed lawn, her laughter floating in the cool morning air. I watched her, feeling my heart loosen for the first time in days. And then I saw him. A figure behind the west fence, standing exactly where I had seen someone days earlier. This time he did not hide. He stood half-concealed behind the trunk of a tree, eyes fixed not on me, but on Eliza, watching her with a patient stillness, as though waiting for me to look away for just one single breath. Just one. The blood in my body turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. I did not think. I ran, scooped Eliza into my arms, holding her so tightly she gasped. She clung to my neck, frightened. "Mommy, what is wrong? It is all right. I am here." I looked back. He was gone. No footsteps, no broken branch, no trace, as though he had never stood there at all. But I had seen him, and he was closer than ever. I carried Eliza inside, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the keys trying to lock the door. I set her down, and she rested her head in my lap while I stroked her hair with trembling fingers. "Are you okay, Mommy?" I nodded through tears spilled without permission. I could not hold myself steady anymore. I was spent. I had run far enough. I had been strong long enough. I had held terror inside so long it had become part of my breath. But now, no matter how tightly I wrapped my arms around my world, something outside was still reaching for us. Reaching for the tiny life I had sworn to protect. And I could not bear that truth. I took Eliza to her room, closed the curtains, locked the door, turned on white noise to cover any sound from outside. She fell asleep quickly from exhaustion and fear. I stood there for a long moment, my back pressed to the wood, my heart pounding as though trying to tear itself free. Then I turned and went downstairs, moving fast, no longer steady, no longer pretending. I went straight to Graham's office and opened the door without knocking, breath shuddering. He looked up instantly, seeing my pale face, my shaking hands curled as though burned. "What happened?" I tried to speak, but my voice shook apart. "Someone is out there." He watched Eliza. "He knows where we are. He..." The words broke and the sob rose before I could swallow it. Graham stood at once and came toward me. I stepped back, but then my strength vanished and I collapsed into the nearest chair. I did not hold composure. I cried, not weak tears. Tears born from fear carried too long, from the crushing weight of failure, from the brutal truth that I could not shield my child with my own hands. Hot tears streamed down my face and my body shook. Graham did not speak, did not pry. He simply placed his hand on my shoulder. Then, as if sensing the last wall fall inside me, he pulled me against him. It was not the embrace of a man comforting an employee. It was the embrace of someone who knew what it meant to fear losing the one thing that mattered. His hold was firm, warm, steady, not rushing, not invading, just enough to remind me I did not have to stand alone in that moment. I do not know how long I cried, but I remember resting my head against his chest, eyes closed, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat, as though that sound alone could anchor me. His voice came low and certain. Julia, you and Eliza are not going anywhere. He will not touch either of you, not while I draw breath. His tone was solid as stone. I did not know if it was a promise or an oath, but for the first time in so long I believed. Not in invincibility, but in the possibility of someone standing between me and the dark that hunted us. In that moment, I did not run. I surrendered. Not to Graham Blackwell, but to the fragile place inside me I had buried for years. I let myself be held. I let myself be protected, if only for a breath in time. Even knowing the storm still waited beyond these walls. I stayed in his arms, and for the first time in what felt like years, I exhaled. I don't remember when I fell asleep, only that when I opened my eyes again, the sky outside the window had turned to amber. The light of late afternoon slipped through the canopy of trees, casting moving shadows of leaves on the wall, as though someone was painting a quiet, aching dream just for me. I was lying on the long chaise in the southern reading room of the estate, a light blanket draped across my legs, and Graham was sitting in the armchair opposite, a book open in his hands but his eyes resting entirely on me. There was no sound but the gentle ticking of the old mantel clock. A silence that didn't feel heavy, but instead, strangely healing. I pushed myself up slowly, my voice rough from the unraveling that had come before. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here like that. Graham closed the book and set it gently on the side table. Don't apologize for feeling. You've lived so long inside your fear that you've convinced yourself you're not allowed to break. But you're wrong. Everyone has the right to fall apart, especially those who still get up every day for a child. I looked at him then, really looked, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Not coldness, not pity, but a kind of quiet knowing, as if he had walked through the very same ache I carried. And then, without prompting, he began to speak, slowly, calmly. But each word felt like it had been pulled from a grief so deep it had long since stopped screaming. I once had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was born on a spring day so beautiful it felt unreal. Eyes blue like her mother's, hair the color of early sunlight, and a laugh so clear it sounded like glass. Lily was the most beautiful thing I ever had. When she came into my life, suddenly everything felt like it had meaning. Graham paused, his eyes drifting, as though he were seeing her now, somewhere just beyond the reach of the room's golden light. But I didn't know how to be a father. I was too young, too ambitious, too blind to see what I was sacrificing. I thought that if I made money, built something solid, kept the family secure, that would be enough. But she didn't need money. She needed me. She needed a father who knew how to listen, who showed up, who understood that the smallest moments were often the most important. And I failed at that. He didn't cry. His voice didn't crack. But there was a stillness in him, a weight that only someone who had lost something irreplaceable could carry. I didn't ask what happened next. I didn't have to. The silence that followed told me that Lily was gone, not just from his life, but from the world. And that loss had carved itself into him, becoming a quiet, permanent scar. And in that shared stillness, I realized something. Graham Blackwell was not a man untouched by pain. He was a man who had once tried to outrun it and lost. A man who knew exactly what it meant to love something fragile, and to fail it. And perhaps that was why he had reached for me. For Eliza, not out of pity or responsibility, but because somewhere, in the broken corners of his heart, he had already known what it meant to stand between danger and a child's life. And this time, he would not stand too far away. His face tightened just slightly, a thin fracture in the armor I once believed could never break. When Lily turned 8, her mother learned she had cancer. Everything collapsed too fast to understand. In less than a year, she was gone, and suddenly, I was all Lily had left. But instead of being her shelter, I buried myself deeper in work, in deals, in controlling everything except the one thing that truly mattered. I hired caretakers. I paid for the best private school. I surrounded her with security systems and guards and layers of protection, but I did not hold her when she was afraid. I did not listen when she was sad. I was not there when she needed me. I swallowed hard, unable to interrupt the quiet, devastating current of memory rising in his voice, like a deep tide that once it surfaced, could not be stopped. When Lily turned 13, she became quiet. She stopped texting every day. She no longer ran to the gate when I came home. I told myself it was just adolescence. I told myself it would pass. Then one morning, I got a call from the hospital. Lily had been rushed into emergency care after an overdose. No one knew why. There was no note, no warning signs. And to this day, I still do not know if it was an accident or her final plea for help that I never heard. My hand rose to my mouth, trying to hold back the tremor in my breath. Graham did not cry, but his eyes were empty in a way that made my heart break open inside my chest. Lily died 3 days later. For those 3 days, I sat beside her bed, held her hand, prayed, promised I would change, that I would start over, that I would spend the rest of my life repairing what I broke. But she never woke up. And from that moment, I knew I had lost the one thing in this world that could never be bought back at any price. The room felt heavy, soaked through with grief that had settled years ago and never left. I stood and walked toward him, not out of pity, but gratitude. Gratitude for being allowed to see the wound beneath the steel. That someone who looked unshakable could carry a pain so deep it no longer bled, only lived in silence. I laid my hand gently over his. I am sorry. No one should have to endure that. He lifted his gaze to mine, and for the first time, those gray eyes were not guarded or distant. They softened, as if he had found in me a reflection of a soul once lost. Julia, do not become me. If you have a chance to hold on to your child, hold on with everything you are. Do not let anyone or anything take her from you. He did not need to say anything more. I understood. And in that moment, standing between old wounds and new dangers, I knew we had stepped far beyond the borders of a performance. There are things you cannot fake: pain and compassion. The summons arrived on a bleak morning, the ocean wind carrying the bitter scent of salt and cold through every crack of the windows. Evelyn delivered the envelope without comment, set it on the breakfast table, and walked away. Eliza sat beside me, coloring, her small fingers gripping the crayon as if holding on to something dear. I did not want to open the letter with her there, but my hands moved anyway, unable to resist. Only a few lines printed on ivory paper. The court requires your presence to provide testimony in the review of custody regarding Eliza, pursuant to a petition submitted by Ronald Shaw. I stared at the words until they blurred, until my breath turned shallow. Ronald was not lurking in shadows anymore. He was stepping into the light, reaching with the full force of law, money, and power. And the world I had built around my child trembled, fragile as glass held too tight in trembling hands. I sat frozen. The kitchen, a space that had started to feel like a piece of home, suddenly turned foreign. As if, with a single envelope, I had been dragged back into the old world where everything was ruled by him. He was no longer threatening from the shadows. Now he was using the law to reach into my new life, to pull me into the light, to force me to answer, to appear, to prove. Once again, I was being positioned as the one on trial. I wasn't afraid, because I had done something wrong. I was afraid because I knew he had money, connections, and an entire system built to bend truth to his will. And I was just a single mother who had run no assets, no lawyer, no legal ground beneath my feet. I went upstairs to Graham's study and knocked. He was standing in front of the bookshelf, eyes distant, a book still closed in his hand. When I handed him the court summons, he didn't ask any questions. He just looked at me, then gave a slow, steady nod. "He's gone this far already?" I nodded. "I don't know what he's going to claim. Maybe that I'm unstable. Maybe that I kidnapped her. With him, there's no line he won't cross." Graham stood silent for a moment, then said, "I'll go with you." I looked up, startled. "You don't have to do that. This is my fight. You're not involved." He placed his hand on my shoulder, not forceful, but firm enough to keep me standing. "I've been involved since the moment I brought you both into this house. Since the moment I gave my word that Eliza would be safe. And if I have to step into the spotlight to keep that promise, I will." There was no bravado in his voice, no performative chivalry, just quiet, unwavering conviction. And in that moment, I understood something about Graham Blackwell that went beyond the sharp suits and guarded glances. He was a man who had once failed to protect the person he loved most, and now he would not let that happen again. Not to Eliza. Not to me. The Charleston County Courthouse stood tall in its quiet, formidable dignity, a red brick building with worn stone steps leading up to heavy wooden doors that had witnessed more judgment than mercy. That morning, Graham appeared beside me at the foot of those stairs, dressed in a light gray suit, his face calm, composed, as unreadable as always. Eliza had remained behind at the estate under the care of Evelyn and a dedicated security team. As we approached the courthouse, the air filled with the sharp flickers of camera flashes. Reporters crowded the steps, voices rising, snapping photos. But I didn't stop. I tightened my grip on Graham's hand. He squeezed back just enough to say, without words, that I wasn't alone. Inside the courtroom, Ronald sat on the far side. He wore a crisp white shirt beneath a dark navy jacket, his hair neatly combed, his expression as cold and blank as polished stone. He looked at me like I wasn't there. But that stare no longer made my bones tremble the way it once did, because this time I wasn't standing alone. When the judge asked me to explain why I had left without notice, I told the truth. All of it. I spoke of bruises and nightmares, of Eliza's face every time she saw him. I spoke of the years we spent hidden, the endless moving, the nights I sat awake with my ear pressed to the door. And when my voice began to shake under the weight of it all, Graham stood. He walked steadily to the witness stand. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I am Graham Blackwell. I confirm that Julia Monroe and her daughter have resided in my home since the 13th of last month. During that time, I have assumed full responsibility for their safety. I also confirm, without reservation, that Julia is a responsible, rational mother, and the only individual in this room acting in the true interest of the child." The room went still. Not a single word from Ronald's lawyers, no objections from his team, because Graham Blackwell's presence didn't need to be explained. His name alone carried weight in security, in business, in the unspoken hierarchy of those who were never questioned. And that morning, he used it not for himself, but for me. When the hearing ended, we walked back out through the front doors into the waiting crowd. The flashes resumed. The questions flew. But this time, I held my head high. I no longer flinched at being seen, because beside me stood a man who had chosen to walk into the light for me, not in secret, not behind locked doors, but here, under the harshest glare of public scrutiny. And that visibility, that small, unwavering act of being present, changed everything. No one could call me a runaway anymore. No one could call me weak or invisible. I was Eliza's mother, and I would fight with every breath, every truth, every ounce of strength I had left to keep my daughter by my side. That evening, Charleston opened to rain, sudden and persistent, as if the sky itself were warning of something to come. I had just tucked Eliza into bed, straightened the thin blanket across her chest, when thunder rolled in the distance and lightning slit the window pane. Graham had left his study earlier, but the library light still burned, and as I moved toward the kitchen for a cup of ginger tea, a strange unease slid into my ribs, a feeling of someone crossing an unseen boundary. I stepped into the hall, the rain heavy on the tile roof making the house feel quieter than usual. As I passed the foot of the stairs, a soft sound came from the side door near the kitchen, a sound not loud but wrong, the creak of a hinge opening slowly. I froze, breath held. Another click, clearer this time. It could not have been the staff. They had left hours ago. It could not have been Evelyn. She never came without warning. Then a shadow flashed past the glass door into the storage wing. My hand shook as I pulled my phone and tried to call Graham, but there was no signal. The screen flashing words about connection lost. I backed against the wall and listened for every movement below. A footstep, then another, then a stop. The library door burst open. I heard glass shatter and things collide, and then a sound that stopped my heart. The sound of struggling, a groan of pain and a heavy crash as if someone had been thrown into a bookshelf. I ran down the stairs, nearly slipping on the last tread. The library door stood wide and Graham lay on the floor, his brow wet with blood, one hand gripping a scraped forearm. Standing over him was Ronald, the man I had thought a nightmare, and now saw in the flesh, dressed in black, his face twisted under the dim light. He turned and looked at me with a half smile, the kind that belongs to someone who at last catches prey after a long hunt. I told you you could not hide forever, Julia. You were foolish to think hiding behind an old, powerful man would keep your child safe forever. The blood in my ears drowned everything else. I lunged to pull Graham away, but Ronald stepped forward and drew a small knife from his belt, the steel flashing and freezing me in place. Graham watched my movement and rasped, "Back away, Julia. Now." But I would not move. I met Ronald's eyes and said if he wanted Eliza, he would have to go through me. He laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "I do not need to kill you. I only need Eliza. She is my child. She will come back to me." Before I could respond, Graham sprang up despite his wound and threw himself at Ronald, forcing him backward. They grappled fiercely amid toppled books, the room erupting in shouts, breaking glass, and the thud of feet on floorboards. I stumbled back, groping for my phone and finding it gone. A lamp fell, its light snuffed out, and the only illumination left leaked from the hallway, thin and uncertain. Eventually, Graham twisted, driving his shoulder hard into Ronald's gut, slamming him backward into the wall. In one swift motion, he tore the knife from Ronald's hand and kicked it across the room. At that moment, the alarm sounded, sharp and piercing, just as the estate's security team stormed in. Two men took Ronald down immediately, restraining him on the floor with a precision born from experience. Another helped Graham to his feet. I ran to him, my hands instantly stained with blood. He looked at me and managed a faint smile. "I'm all right. Just a shallow cut. It's not the first time I've bled for someone I want to protect. But this time, I won't lose." I gripped his hand tightly and said nothing. In that moment, among shattered books and the iron tang of blood and steel, I knew something irreversible had happened. Ronald had not only broken into the Blackwell estate, he had stepped into the final moments of his own power, never expecting anyone would dare stand in his way. But Graham, blood still streaking his brow and doubt gone from his eyes, had just carved his name into the fractured past I had once carried alone. This wasn't pretend anymore. From this moment forward, we were no longer performing. We were simply two people who had chosen to stand because of a child, because of a second chance, and because of each other. 3 days after the attack, we left the Blackwell estate behind. The house I once believed to be the safest place in my world had become a memory written in blood, in screams, in steel, and in the presence of a man I had once loved, once feared, and now felt only a cold revulsion toward. Graham didn't ask. He made the decision that same night. The three of us would be relocated to a high-security facility tucked deep in the woods west of Charleston. A place without signs, without an open gate, where no one arrived unless invited and no one left without a reason. As the car rolled past the towering steel gates and onto the gravel road lined with pine and ash, I turned back. Beneath the canopy of fading trees, the estate slowly disappeared behind a veil of soft rain. Eliza slept between us, curled against Graham's shoulder, while I sat in silence, fists clenched, trying to steady the storm inside me. I knew I should feel safe. Ronald had been arrested. He would be prosecuted. But fear doesn't die just because the threat has been bound. It lingers. It festers like an old wound that never quite closes. The secure compound was surrounded by thick forest and protected by concrete walls that loomed higher than a man's reach, lined with sensors and motion alerts. The new house was smaller than the estate, but every detail had been engineered for protection, detection, and response. Bulletproof windows, doors requiring both fingerprints and passcodes, surveillance 24 hours a day. Evelyn had come with us, along with two new security agents that Graham trusted without question. I stood in the cold granite-tiled kitchen, opened the cabinet, and stared blankly inside, already forgetting what I came for. My eyes burned from too many sleepless nights, and my heart refused to believe the worst was truly over. I didn't know if this feeling was trauma or some terrible clarity, but I understood now, with a quiet dread, that what was breaking me wasn't just Ronald. It was the loss of something more subtle, more precious. The ability to believe in peace. Eliza seemed to feel the shift too. She didn't cry, but her sleep was restless. Sometimes I found her staring out the window at the empty courtyard below, as if trying to reclaim something familiar. I sat beside her, smoothed her hair, told stories, hummed lullabies, but even my voice felt like it was echoing from somewhere far away, as though I no longer knew how to anchor us back to solid ground. And I wondered, not for the first time, when I would ever truly feel normal again. Or if that had become a dream I no longer had the right to chase. That evening, after Evelyn put Eliza to bed early, I wandered into the small yard behind the house. The wind rushed through the forest, rattling branches as though someone were moving quietly beneath the cover of trees. I stood in the center of the clearing, tipped my face toward a sky thick with clouds, trying to breathe deeply. Yet even the air stung with a cold so sharp it felt like it pierced straight into my skull. I did not cry. I did not tremble. But inside me, a quiet panic had already begun to uncoil. I thought of what I had endured, the nights running through darkness, the hours sitting outside Eliza's door with a kitchen knife in hand, the moments when footsteps echoed and I did not dare move. And I wondered whether I was living or merely existing inside layers of protection someone else had built around me. I did not know when Graham stepped out. He stood behind me, not approaching, only speaking with a voice soft as wind. There are people who spend their whole lives running, not because they are weak, but because no one ever taught them how to stay. I turned. My eyes dry, though inside it felt as if something had been quietly cut open. I spoke in the smallest voice. And if I never learn to stay, Graham, if all I know is how to run. He came closer, not touching me, only standing beside me, near enough for his warmth to reach me. Then I will stay with you, for as long as it takes. We said nothing more. Only the wind moved through the trees, and silence was no longer frightening. It became a promise without sound that fear might still sit inside me, but I was no longer alone. And sometimes, that alone is the first step toward not running again. Night deepened. The small house in the woods rested inside a thick hush, with only a golden sliver of light spilling from the library door. I sat curled in the armchair near the fireplace, a cold cup of tea in my hands, eyes fixed on the soft glow dancing across warm brown wood. Outside, the wind murmured through the pines. No cars, no voices, not even a nightbird calling. Only breath, heartbeat, and quiet questions that never found words. I no longer remembered exactly when I ceased being the woman who once stepped out of a tiny apartment with a single suitcase and a child in her arms, or when Graham first looked at me without the distance reserved for an employee or a name in a security file. I did not remember when the change began. I only knew my fear was no longer a wild creature clawing inside me. It had retreated. It was tired. And for the first time, I felt myself settling into a silence that was real, not born from dread. The soft sound of footsteps stirred the quiet. I lifted my head and saw Graham in the doorway. No coat, only dark shirt and trousers, his hair slightly tousled. He did not ask why I was awake. He knew. Just as I knew he could not sleep either. He came closer and took the chair across from me, gazing into the fire for a long while, saying nothing. There was no need. In that room, in that fragile stillness, the words left unspoken were what bound us most deeply. Then he turned to me. Julia, do you remember who you were before all of this? The question drifted out softly, yet it reached a part of me so deep I didn't know it could still feel. I lowered my head and gave a quiet, almost breathless smile. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think I'm a mother. Sometimes I feel like nothing but a shadow. And right now, I don't know anymore. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. I remember the Julia I met the first time. Her face was set like stone when she spoke, her eyes always guarded. But I also remember those same eyes when you looked at Eliza, like the whole world rested inside that little girl. And tonight, I saw that again. Not just when you looked at your daughter, but when you looked at me. I exhaled, and it felt like something inside me collapsed, a wall I had built too high for too long, finally giving way to light. I looked at him, my eyes damp not from sadness, but from the weight of truths I had never dared speak. I never thought I could trust someone the way I once did. But I have. Without promises, without labels, without any strings. I trust that you won't let me fall. I trust that you truly want Eliza safe. And I trust what I feel each time I see you walk into a room. Neither of us stood. Neither of us rushed. The silence between us thickened, not with tension, but with something unnamed drawing nearer. Graham leaned forward, his hand resting on mine, not pressing, just touching. A touch that asked nothing, demanded nothing, yet woke every nerve in me like a call after long sleep. I leaned toward him too. Everything moved slowly enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. And then his lips touched mine, light as breath, warm as a windless forest night. That kiss was unlike anything that had ever passed between us. It wasn't part of a performance, not for appearances, not to sell a story. It was real. It was the continuation of every quiet embrace, every time he stepped in front of me when danger neared, every glance that lingered just a second too long. It was a sentence we never spoke aloud, that we weren't pretending anymore, that something still undefined had begun the moment we chose not to turn away from each other. When our lips parted, neither of us spoke. I rested my head against his shoulder. Graham wrapped his arm around me and held on. No unnecessary words, no hurried promises, just presence. A kind of presence I had gone without for so many years. And that night, deep in the quiet woods, in a room lined with warm wood and soft firelight, I understood something simple and profound. Not all beginnings need fireworks or grand announcements. Sometimes they only need a kiss, and someone who chooses to stay. The news broke on a Monday morning, just as I had finished pouring Graham's coffee, and Eliza was at the kitchen table drawing, her collar stained with blue ink and her ponytail crooked, just as always. The television had been on low in the background. I hadn't been paying it any mind until I heard three words that sent a chill down my spine. Ronald Shaw. I turned sharply. The anchor was delivering the report in a voice so calm it felt cold, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of shock. A recording had just been released. Ronald Shaw caught discussing a bribe with a court official, along with other audio evidence tying him to the surveillance and intimidation of witnesses. My name, Julia Monroe, was mentioned at least 3 times during that broadcast, accompanied by grainy photos of me and Eliza at the courthouse, and one of Graham resting his hand on my shoulder as we left the courtroom. These were no longer whispered suspicions or murmured rumors. This time, the entire city of Charleston knew, perhaps even the whole country. I stood frozen, coffee cooling in my hand, my mind blank. Not from fear, from sheer surprise. I hadn't had this evidence. I didn't know where it had come from, but I could guess. Graham entered the kitchen just as I turned toward him. He simply placed a steady hand on my back, the kind of gesture that needed no explanation. I told you, he said without speaking. I wouldn't let him touch you again. This was my way. I wanted to ask how he'd done it, but I knew better. With Graham, that question was redundant. He always had a way. Maybe it was someone inside the court. Maybe it was a hacker. Maybe a forgotten recording buried in some archived file. What mattered more than the method was the fact that he had kept his word. And now, the truth could no longer be denied. Ronald was no longer the polished man once featured on finance magazine covers. No longer the former entrepreneur politicians had posed beside. He was now exposed an abuser, a manipulator, dragged out into the harsh light of the biggest newspaper in South Carolina. Graham switched off the television. Eliza kept coloring, blissfully unaware of the storm outside. I looked at her, then back to him. My eyes asked the question I couldn't say aloud. Is this the end? He shook his head slowly. No. This is the beginning. Because now you have a voice. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to bend beneath the weight of invisible threats. The media will roar for a while, but it will pass. What remains is the truth. And the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The truth, that word I had carried inside me for so many years like a hidden wound, was finally out in the open. No documents, no proof, just bruises. Sleepless nights. The sound of Eliza's breath hitching after each nightmare. But now I didn't have to prove anything anymore. I didn't have to say again and again that I wasn't crazy, that I didn't make it all up. They saw it for themselves. The full investigation leak had shaken Charleston's legal system within hours. A presiding judge resigned, a court official was suspended, and Ronald, who had once merely faced a civil dispute, was now under criminal indictment. My phone rang nonstop all morning, interview requests, a book proposal from a publisher, even messages from strangers apologizing for once believing what the papers had written, but I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I no longer needed to. I didn't need pity. I needed to live in a truth I had spent my youth protecting. To live so that Eliza could grow up without being pulled back into a past drenched in shadows. That afternoon, Graham sat reading the news on his tablet while I sorted through paperwork in preparation for the next court hearing. He looked up, studying me for a moment as though weighing something. Then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. You know, People like Ronald believe they're untouchable because they have money and because others are afraid. But the only thing that ever sustains their power is silence. Today, we broke that. I nodded. There was nothing more to say. Because in that moment, I understood though the fight wasn't over, I was no longer the woman who only knew how to run. I was a witness, a mother, a survivor. And for the first time, I was allowed to stand in the light without lowering my head. The Charleston County Courthouse was strangely quiet that morning, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting for a hearing that carried more than just personal weight. It marked the end of a long season where truth had been smothered by power and fear. I sat in the front row, my hands gripping the wooden edge of the bench, my chest rising and falling too fast, as if the air had thickened around me. Beside me, Graham was silent. He didn't need to speak. Just one look from him was enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Eliza wasn't in the courtroom that day. Evelyn had taken her to the park, far from the words no 6-year-old should ever have to hear. Across the room, Ronald entered in a dark suit, his face pale after weeks in custody and the avalanche of scandals that had surfaced. He no longer carried the arrogance of a man who once commanded boardrooms with a single glance. Now he was simply a man stripped of power, trying to appear composed while his hands trembled each time his lawyer spoke. I looked at him and felt no hatred, only an emptiness, a quiet, cold space in me, like staring at the ghost of something I had already left far behind. The judge was a middle-aged woman, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her voice steady and clear. She allowed no emotion to color her words, but her eyes held something I never expected to find in a courtroom: the willingness to listen, understanding, and a stern resolve toward those who used power to dismantle the lives of others. As the hearing began, my lawyer laid out the evidence that had already circulated in the public eye: the recordings, the bank transfers, the testimony of the former security contractor Ronald had paid to follow me. Nothing now was left to speculation. It was no longer a matter of belief. Everything was fact. Graham took the stand as a witness. He spoke about the time Eliza and I had spent living in his estate, the security measures he had implemented, and Eliza's emotional stability under my care. He didn't speak with flourish or force, just plainly, truthfully. And this time, the truth had a place to stand. Ronald objected, blamed it on work stress, on misunderstandings, but no one in that courtroom believed him. The silence that followed each of his words wasn't out of sympathy. It was because people were tired of hearing a liar explain away real damage. By mid-morning, the judge read her ruling. Her voice was steady, neither rushed nor dramatic, but every word felt carved into my heart. Based on the evidence presented, in accordance with statutes protecting the rights of the child, and with full consideration of the care environment, the court hereby grants Julia Monroe full and sole legal custody of Eliza Monroe. Visitation rights for Ronald Shaw are suspended indefinitely, pending substantial and verified improvement in psychological, ethical, and behavioral standing. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat still, hands resting in my lap, feeling something rise slowly through my chest like a tide, but it didn't crash. It moved gently, quietly, soaking into every vein. It was freedom. Not the kind signed into law, but true freedom. Freedom to be a mother without fear. Freedom to love my child without having to run. Graham took my hand and held it tight. I turned to him and saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a quiet joy in a man who once lost everything, now watching someone else hold on to what mattered most. When we stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was high. The air no longer felt heavy. I walked out into the light, no longer the woman hiding behind tangled hair and guarded eyes. I walked out as a mother in full, one who had stood up, fought, and won. And when I saw Eliza running toward me, hair flying, holding up a drawing of us hand in hand, I knew it had all been worth it. Every wound, every fall, every moment I almost gave up had led here. I pulled her into my arms, held her close, and whispered not as a promise, but as something sacred that no longer needed repeating. I'm here, always. That afternoon, after the court hearing, the three of us returned to the little house in the woods, wrapped in a quiet unlike any I had known. It wasn't the silence of tension or exhaustion, but a hush that came when, at last, you could exhale after holding your breath for far too long. As soon as Eliza stepped through the door, she ran straight to her bedroom, where she had hidden a few toys arranged into a small makeshift dollhouse. Evelyn followed her in to prepare dinner, leaving Graham and me in the living room, where the golden light of late afternoon spilled through the sheer curtains, soft and slow. I slipped off my shoes, folded my light jacket over the back of a chair, and sank onto the sofa. Graham remained standing. His shadow stretched long across the wooden floor in that low amber light. He turned to me, his eyes steady, but it took him a few quiet breaths before he spoke. Everything I promised you, I've done. His voice was low, not seeking praise, just a simple statement, like he was quietly counting the footsteps we had taken to get here. I nodded and smiled. You've done more than I ever dared to hope. He sat beside me then, closer than he'd ever sat before, the polite distance between us no longer necessary. He reached out and laid his hand gently on mine. Julia, the first time I asked you to stay, it was part of the plan. For safety. For strategy. But if I ask again now, not because of a plan, not to protect, not for any reason, but because I want to, what then? I turned toward him. There was no calculation in his face. No hesitation either, the kind people often wear when they ask someone to enter their life for real. Only calm. That kind of calm that comes from having already weighed everything and still choosing the one thing that brings peace. I pulled my hand away, not to refuse him, but to hold it for myself just a moment longer. Then I spoke. Are you sure? This isn't a role anymore. There's no script. If I stay with every crack in me, with every sleepless night, every quiet panic that has no warning. I'm not whole. I'm not easy to love, and I can't promise I won't disappoint you. Graham smiled, but there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. Something gentle and knowing. I don't need you whole. I just need you real. And I've seen that woman in the way you look at your daughter like she holds the whole world, in the way you stood in front of me when Ronald had a knife, in the silence you kept while the world made too much noise to hear how much you hurt. I'm not looking for someone to decorate my life. I'm looking for someone to walk beside me. And if you let me, I believe this time we won't have to pretend anymore. I looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to see a version of myself reflected in his gaze, a version I never thought possible. A woman not defined by fear, but by what she had the courage to keep. I reached out and touched his hand this time. I was the one who reached first. And I nodded. Okay. But this time, it's real. No performance, no contract, no words with strings attached. Let's try. As two people who are tired of holding everything up alone and who finally choose to sit down beside one another. Graham didn't say anything more. He only leaned in and pressed a kiss to my forehead, light as the last note at the end of a long song. Not a kiss of passion. Not a promise wrapped in obligation. Just a beginning. When Eliza came running from her bedroom, beaming with a new drawing in her hands, Graham reached for mine, his fingers closing around mine like something finally finding its place. And I knew, this time, no one was acting anymore. This was a real story, with all the scars, and all the hope that still remained. Morning in the quiet forest was drenched in the gentle sunlight of spring. Golden rays pierced through the canopy, shimmering on the forest floor like soft strokes of warmth painting a living canvas. Eliza was running freely across the grassy backyard, her brown hair lifted by the breeze, her little feet leaving round prints in the soft earth. Her laughter rang clear and pure through the still air, as if all the old wounds had melted away with the morning mist. I sat on the front steps, a cup of warm ginger tea in hand, my eyes following her, and for the first time in a long while, my heart slowly began to unwind after months of being clenched tight. Graham sat beside me. His eyes, too, followed Eliza, but now and then he glanced over at me, as if still growing used to the peace that had found its way between us. I tilted my head, touched the back of his hand lightly, and he gently closed his fingers around mine, not tightly, but just enough to remind me I was no longer alone. In that moment, no words were needed. We understood each other. There were no more roles to play, no more fear of being seen, no more living beneath someone else's shadow or the weight of our own pasts. There was only the present, the two of us, and a child laughing in the sunlight. Watching Eliza play, carefree like any child her age, I suddenly realized something that felt impossibly simple, yet had taken me a lifetime to understand. That happiness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from the small things, offered sincerely, from a hand held at the right time, from an embrace that asks for nothing in return, from someone who chooses to stay when everyone else has walked away, and sometimes, from a chance to begin again even if it's late as long as it's honest. Life isn't easy for everyone, least of all for women who have stepped out of darkness as I once did. But if you still believe in love and in kindness, then you still have a chance at happiness. What do you think about the story of Julia, Graham, and Eliza? Did it stir something deep inside your heart? Maybe you've known loss. Maybe you've stood at the edge of despair. Maybe you've questioned whether you still deserve to be loved. If so, I want you to know you do. You are still enough. And sometimes, the journey to finding yourself doesn't begin with a grand revelation. Sometimes it starts with someone quietly choosing to walk beside you, without asking for anything in return. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel and clicking like to show your support. This is a space where every story is told straight from the heart for those who've ever felt small in a world too vast, yet never gave up hope. Share your thoughts in the comments. We truly want to hear what's on your mind. What part of the story touched you most? Do you know someone like Julia? Or are you, perhaps, on your own journey back to peace? Every comment you leave is not just a reply. It's a part of the healing journey we are building together, story by story. Thank you for taking the time to listen. We'll see you in the next video on Dear Single Mom, with more stories that move, reflect, and remind us what it means to be human. Until then, we wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and a reason to smile each day. Goodbye for now, and until we meet again.